So I think it's stressful no matter what. And I think ultimately, when you have rentals, you really just have to plan for like somebody's going to treat it as if it's not the same way as you would treat your own home, and you have to kind of plan for that.
Welcome to Real Stories in Real Estate with your host, Denise Laframboise. Real people sharing real stories about their adventures in real estate.
Laframboise, and today I'm talking with TANJA COUGHLAN, and she's going to share a little bit about her experience buying a rental property.
Hey, Denise, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So thanks for being here. So do you want to share a little bit about what you guys did when you decided you wanted to buy another home?
Well, yeah, I guess it would have been something we had been thinking about for a while, in terms of, how do we make our money work smarter for us? And, what kind of things could we do? And, a rental property is one of those ideas that kind of had popped up. And then it just kind of happened that there was a new subdivision being built in Oshawa, so not too far from us. And we went and kind of took a look, and given the build time was going to be a couple years, it just seemed like it was a smart idea to put a small amount of money down up front, and then a couple of years later, hopefully the prices had already kind of gone up, and then we might be able to either rent it out or even sell it if we decided we didn't want to proceed. So I think our total amount at that time, I'm sure things have changed a lot since then, but I think we only had to put, I think maybe it was like $5,000 immediately down, and then another $5,000 a few weeks later, and then a month or two later another $10,000. So it was like $20,000 that was really kind of tied up for a couple of years until the property was actually built. So that's kind of how we came up with the idea. We'd like to kind of do something like that, and then we thought the location was good because it wasn't too far from where we were living already. So that's kind of how we ended up with that particular property. And just, it gave us some time to figure out, okay, if we are going to do this, how do we go about, if we do want to rent it out, how do we become landlords, and what's even involved in that? So it gave us lots of time to figure that out before the house was actually going to be ready to go.
Yeah. And in this market, we find a lot more people are buying pre-construction from builders because you don't have to compete with 60 other offers or whatever it is to get a home too, right?
Yeah.
Like we're seeing a lot of young people that, they beat out of a bunch of homes and they're like, you know what, I give up. I'm just going to buy this from this builder. And then at least we know we're going to get it. It's going to be a few years down the road, but we're not fighting the same way when there's a lack of supply right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, pros and cons about, buying something new if you're intending it to be a rental property. And, we can talk about that too, but.
Well, let's talk about the good stuff. So what was really good about your experience?
Well, I think what was good about the experience is, the increase in property value over the few years that we owned it was fairly significant. So I felt like it was, once, you had that, like I said, there's only like a $20,000 upfront investment that, you weren't necessarily making any money on for a couple of years. But then, I think we had the property for about 3.5, 4 years. And over that time, the amount of, what we bought it for versus what we sold it for was a $200,000 increase. So, I mean,
right. And how much overtime would you have to work to make $200,000?
Yeah, exactly. So that was great. I mean, obviously there was still the capital gains we had to pay on real estate fees. There's upkeep over time, but it was we had the renters in there, they were really paying off the mortgage. So, I just thought from that standpoint, it was a fabulous opportunity. And it worked out really well for us in terms of, making, we kind of missed that little bit of a bubble that we maybe could have sold it for even more, but I think we did quite well. I was pleased with the way things turned out. So that was definitely a plus.
Yeah. And there's there's a saying that says you make your money when you buy your home, not when you sell it. Mm-hmm. And it's true that because you bought in a good area that's going up in value, that was very desirable, you're always going to make money on that. If you had bought in a different area where prices weren't going up as much, or it wasn't as marketable or desirable, maybe it wouldn't be the same experience. But when you buy in a great location, you're always going to do well.
Yeah. And we also, the area where we bought in Oshawa was close to college. So we were kind of confident that it was close enough that, even if we, our our dream was like, oh, we get some, sessional professors that would want to come and live there. And, but of course that didn't
Yes.
happen. We ended up with students, but we also knew that that was the backup, that, it was close enough that students would still find it desirable. But if we did want to sell it, it was a family home in a family neighborhood, and that, families would want to buy it. So we weren't defined, like we weren't narrowing ourselves into the type of rent, like the type of person would want to live there longer term, because there was going to be options for people wanting to live in a nice neighborhood, not just it wasn't like pigeonholed as a student rental in a student rental area. So
Right. Yeah. And I mean, students, there's pros and cons, right? Like they say, like students are harder on homes, but like the key is they also always have money. Like I had way more money when I was going to college than I ever have now, right? They always have money. And if they're going to drop out of school, like they're not the tenants who are going to stay there forever and not pay you. They'll just go home,
yeah. Yeah,
right?
and we made their parents sign a guarantor form in every case. So we kind of felt like we had covered ourselves a little bit from, if they did end up, leaving. But the thing is they're also like, 3 different students that were living there, and if you happen to have lost one of them, again, you're minimizing your risk a little bit. But
Yeah. 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 Your vacancy is different, right? When you have more sources of income.
yeah, or just less, that we also kind of had set it up that if one of them left, they were still all on the hook for the rent, right? Like, so
Right.
it would have been that pressure from their peers not to leave them high and dry. So
Nice. So what are some things that maybe didn't go so well, or some things that you learned that you didn't know before you bought this property?
well, the first one is the fact that it was a new home, and so there was delays on when it was going to be available, which made it a little bit tricky. And then they suddenly decided, okay, well, we're going to, it's going to be yours as of like, it's like the first week in March or something. You're like, okay, well, wow, there's now 3 weeks of like, we're going to have to start paying on this before we could possibly have somebody like, rent it. And then they weren't done certain things. So like they made us take possession, but then there was all kinds of little things they hadn't finished doing. And so I started like, right away. We happened to have a trip planned for like a week later. So I kind of felt like I had like a week to like hopefully get somebody to like sign an agreement that we're going to be gone. But they, so we went and we did the inspection, like, well, the stain on the front stairs was all blotchy. And we're like, well, that needs to be fixed. So but I had already arranged these showings, but they went ahead and started fixing the stain on the front entry stairs, like as you get into the entryway into the house. And so I'm like, but people are gonna have to walk on that to get in to see the house. So that was like a little bit of a pain. And then of course, once you have tenants and they're trying to get these little things fixed, it's a little bit more coordination, right? Because you have to give them notice that this is going to happen, and then you want to be there to inspect what's happening. So that was a bit of a pain. The biggest challenge that we ended up having was, I had checked the whole, like what you need to do to be able to rent to students when we bought the property. And I knew that around kind of Durham College, UIOT, or, Ontario Tech, or whatever it's called now, that there was a certain zone that you had to have a permit to be able to rent to students. So I had looked at that ahead of time, and our property was not in that zone. And so, no problem. It shouldn't be an issue. I double checked a couple times. It's fine. We're not on the map zone. So we bought the property, we, rented to students, we had them in there. And then about 6 months later, a year later, they sent some bylaw officers around the area knocking on the doors. And of course, people said, oh, we rent the property. And they had changed the zone in terms of what was included in that area where you had to have a permit. So because both my former spouse and I were on the title, they fined us both $1,000 each owner. And then we had to go back and we had to fight this because so I had, first, you go through the process, but I had to go through 3 levels of including going before a tribunal to basically say, like, this is not fair. And then once they finally were, able to like get, they agreed with us, okay, fine, they weren't happy about it, but fine, we won't make you pay this. But then I still had to go through the application process. And then there was this fear, like, what if I don't get approved? So, I had to pay like, I think it was like $600 or $700 a year for the application to be able to do the rentals in that area. And, that every year you had to renew that. And there's always there's the fire inspection, all kinds of stuff. So there's extra stuff that we had to do on top of that. So that made it that made it a little bit more stressful than I was intending to have it.
Well, and the worst part is you did all the research up front. You like a lot of people will buy a property and not check all the zoning and do all those things, but you went to that extra step and did it, and then the town changed where the zoning areas are.
Yeah. Well, it's up to you to know that. I'm like, well, I don't live in the area. How would I ever be notified of something like that? Well, it's not our problem. So
yeah, you'd think they could mail a map, mail you a letter like to the houses in that area, something, right?
Yeah, I think you would know. I mean, all along we'd intended to make sure that, everything was, done by the book, and, it was all being, properly cleaned. But the other thing to keep in mind is if you do buy a new property, usually they have this like GST thing where you're not paying the GST if it's going to be your primary home.
The HST, yeah.
The HST, yeah. And so we knew that going in, that if we were going to rent it out, that clause wasn't applicable to us, and that we were going to have to repay that anyway. So that was a bit of a, it just seemed like it wasn't.
Do you know what else is interesting about that? So we just bought a pre-construction property, and in our contract, the HST that we get goes to the builder. So they're not selling it to us for a certain amount. They're selling it to us for $24,000 less, which is our HST rebate goes to them. Otherwise, our purchase price is higher.
Yeah, and that's basically what happens. We ended up having to pay back that HST because it wasn't going to be our thing. So that was another $15,000 or $20,000 that we paid up front just to make sure again everything was all legit. But like I said,
yeah, the HST thing, it catches up a lot of people on pre-construction, especially because it's not the same when you buy resale. So if it's included in your price or if it's in addition to your price, like it makes a big difference. Yeah. And that's a value of having like a lawyer read through all those contracts with you to make sure that you understand what you're signing and how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, those are very helpful tips for other people, though. And just to know that, unfortunately, you can do all your research up front, and sometimes you're still going to be in a situation where they've changed the rules on you, right?
Yeah. And I guess when you go to sell too, having tenants in there, it makes it slightly more challenging because, if obviously we kind of had timed it that the tenants were going to kind of be moving out anyways. So it because they were students, their lease was up anyways. So it made it easier, but then you still need time if you're trying to sell as quickly as possible. So you're not carrying something that you don't necessarily have the cash to make the mortgage payment. If you don't have the income coming in, there's, a bit of a timing, right? You're trying to do everything as quickly as possible to get the house ready to sell. And of course, as you mentioned, students are maybe a little bit hard on the house. So, we did have to remove all the carpets and put in hardwood and little things like that, sometimes it's not the fastest thing to get people in there to make that, to be able to, put it on the market and get the pictures taken and all that kind of stuff. So.
Well, and from a mortgage perspective, there are a lot of mortgage lenders who will treat properties who have students in it as high risk. So sometimes if it's closer to a college or university or in a certain zone, they may not be okay with it, or they might charge higher interest rates to offset that. But sometimes if there's pictures or on the appraisal, if you have locks on all the bedroom doors, they will perceive that as student rental and potentially not approve the mortgage as a result. So it's really it's interesting how you stage it and what you present it as, how that could affect what your buyers can do too.
Yeah, and within that area in Oshawa too, there's also a stipulation that you cannot rent. It has to be rented to a family or a group that acts as a family. You can't rent individual rooms. You can only rent the house out. So you have to basically prove that this group is like a good group of friends, that they're connected, and that's why they count as like a family kind of unit. You couldn't go out in this particular area. Other areas, I'm sure you can do what you want, but this one, there was very specific rules in terms of how you could actually rent the house out in the first place.
Yeah, and a lot of places do that. A lot of municipalities around any kind of university and college, because they're trying to avoid having those like student ghettos, right, where it's just all student housing all the way through. Yeah. Whatever that movie was with Zac Efron, right, where the family moves in next to the frat house. Yeah, that's what they're avoiding, right? Yeah. So then after all this, would you do it again? Were you happy with your experience? Knowing what you knew now, would you still do it again?
I think I for sure would do it again. I think the only thing though, I might look for a property that maybe wasn't a new build. I mean, I think we probably made more money because it was a new build. Although, I mean, I don't know that for a fact because, everything goes up in value, but I think you get a little bit of an extra bump, but then there was just a little bit extra stressed in terms of like, when is it going to be ready? When is it not? So maybe if I did it again, I probably would look maybe for a resale property as opposed to new. But I mean, pros and cons, right? Like either one, I think I would, if the right opportunity presented itself, I might also do a resale as well.
Yeah. Well, I just always tell people with resale, you know exactly what you're getting.
Yeah.
And your contracts are more fair. Like a contract between a seller and a buyer is much more fair than a contract between a builder and a buyer, right? In those builder contracts, you have things like increased development fees or all kinds of things that can come up or change. Closing dates changing happens all the time, right? When's it closing? I don't know. Is it 2 months? Is it 2 weeks? We'll let you know. Okay. Like, it's one of those things, especially now with them dealing with municipalities. Sometimes they're getting held up or like with all kinds of stuff through the pandemic. Whereas with the resale, you know exactly what you're getting because you're buying this thing, you're getting it on this date for this price for these people, right?
That would definitely simplify the process. So that's why I'm kind of leaning towards, if we do it again, then resale as opposed to new, but
Yeah.
maybe you make better money on the new, I don't know.
Well, and I think truly right now what we're seeing is also the competition piece, right? There's less competition for pre-builds, and also you get exactly what you want brand new, which is kind of nice sometimes too, if you're somebody who doesn't want to do renovations or be more handy with a resale property.
Yeah. Like, I don't know if it also makes a difference to people though, if you buy this brand new house and you picked out all of the finishes and everything that's so sparkly and clean and perfect, and then the tenants are hard on it. It's almost like, oh, like, the cupboard is scratched or whatever. You're just like, it's almost a little dejecting because you put the extra thought. Like as a resale, you get what you get. You're just going to buy what you like, but you haven't put the effort into picking everything perfectly. So.
Yeah, I think it can be the same with resale too. We had our first house, we kept it as a rental, and I had done some renovations that I really liked and put this beautiful chandelier. And then I was like, why are they wrecking my chandelier? Right. Because we moved out and I'm like, it's their house. They're paying my mortgage. It's fine. I'm going to be happy with that. But you're like, oh, why did they do that to the entranceway? Or why did like. So I think it's stressful no matter what. And I think ultimately, when you have rentals, you really just have to plan for like somebody's going to treat it as if it's not the same way as you would treat your own home. And you have to kind of plan for that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I really thank you for sharing your experience. And I think it will help a lot of people. And I just really appreciate you coming and sharing today.
Well, thanks so much for having me here. It was fun.
Awesome. Well, this is the Real Stories in Real Estate podcast. I'm your host, Denise Laframboise, and you can find this podcast on our website, laframboisemortgage.ca. You can find it on Spotify or anywhere else that you consume your podcast. So thanks so much for joining us.